Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah Canning. I'm a safety advisor here with the Newfoundland Labrador Construction Safety Association. And I want to thank you for taking some time out of your day to sit down and engage with us while we're doing this webinar on emergency preparedness and having a bit of a look at working at height. So before we get into it, I just want to go over just a few little, nothing too much, just a little thing. So if you have any questions, I just ask that you just enter it there into the chat feature. And then at the end of the presentation, then I'll take the opportunity just to review your questions and answer any questions, concerns, comments, things like that that you may have throughout this presentation. So with that, let's have a look at what we're going to be discussing here today. So first and foremost, we're just going to have a little look at the legislation and how it applies to emergency preparedness. Then we're going to look at, well, what do we mean by emergency preparedness? What is kind of like the definition of it, and what are some things we should take into consideration? And finally, we're going to finish off the presentation with just talking about the 5 sort of basic steps when it comes to emergency preparedness planning. So with that, let's get started. So we're going into emergency basics. So we're going to have a discussion on the legislative requirements. But before we get into the legislation, I think it's good that we just kind of step back and look at what the definition of what is meant by an emergency. So if we look at what's in front of you there, the slide, you can see that an emergency is defined as an unexpected and usually dangerous situation that calls for immediate action. As well, it can be an unforeseen combination of circumstances or the resulting state that calls for immediate action. And then finally, we see an urgent need for assistance or relief. All right, so basically when we look at this definition, we can really feel the urgency for immediate action, and we need that sort of immediate action so that we can kind of mitigate and control the situation. So the other thing we kind of have to think about when we think of that definition is, well, okay, what do we want personnel to take from that? What do we need them to know when we think of an emergency situation? Well, first and foremost, we can think of, all right, do they understand like the first aid requirements? Do we have sufficient people on site with first aid? But also, if there is an incident, if there is an emergency situation, how are they going to report it? Who are they going to report it to? Also thinking about like, what are the procedures? Do they know where they have to evacuate, like what the routes are, where they're supposed to go, where they're supposed to congregate, as well as, if there is an emergency, we have some kind of notification process or alarm. Well, what does it sound like? And then also looking at the specific roles within that plan, such as, workers who are going to be performing rescue duties versus potentially providing like medical aid or whatnot. And then finally, we have to think, well, how are we accounting for all these people after this sort of potential emergency situation or this emergency situation? So, also good to look at some of the numbers, right? So the first thing we have here is just on the left of your screen is looking at sort of annual numbers here within Canada. So we have 1,000 workers in Canada that die on the job each year. In addition to that, there's 250,000 workers in Canada who suffer work-related injuries or diseases. And this is information that you can see there that was compiled by the Association of Workers' Compensation Boards across Canada. So that's looking at kind of like the national perspective, but now let's have a look at like closer to home. Okay, so let's look at Newfoundland and Labrador. And in particular, I want us to focus on falls in construction, and we're looking just at a short period of time from 2016 to 2020. So if we look at the information that was provided to us from Workplace NL, as well as Occupational Health and Safety Division of Digital Government and Service NL, you can see that 556 workers in the industry received medical aid or lost time from work as a result of a fall. In addition to that, there were 5 fatalities. So just take a moment to think of that. I mean, that's a lot in a very short period of time, and that's only focusing on one kind of specific area. When we look at the costs associated with these falls, this cost approximately $38.6 million in claims costs. When we look at the impact when we think about productivity, time, that sort of stuff, falls resulted in 51,349 weeks of lost work for workers and lost productivity for employers. So when you think of these things, that has a huge implication on the industry. That has a huge implication on all of us, right? So with that, we now, little food for thought. Now we have to think about, well, all right, Elizabeth Conn, you're telling me that sort of those numbers and all that stuff. Well, what do I need to know about the law? What does that tell me? Okay, so there are various references in the legislation which outline kind of employers' responsibilities for various sort of emergency preparedness aspects. I have listed some key references or some more common references. Now keep in mind that the bullets there that I have bolded and italicized, I'll cover in the next few slides. But I just want to give you kind of an outline of the remaining other ones that are there. So for example, if you were to look at section 39 of the regulations, that's generally looking at kind of emergency preparedness in the sense of having a requirement for your annual emergency drill. If I look at section 40 of the regulations, that's going over emergency lighting. Section 41 is going over fire prevention, you know, some basic training, but also looking at if you required kind of further training based on kind of the responsibility you had in fire suppression, that sort of thing. Section 63 is looking at emergency washing facilities, and these are based on assessment of risk within your workplace, okay? And the last one I just wanted to touch base on there is pretty much in relation to if you work in confined space and the rescue requirement for confined space entry, okay? Now, let's look at those bolded and italicized sections. So the law states that where we have an employer who's required to have an occupational health and safety program, within that program, there has to be an emergency response plan. In addition, if we look further on in section 38 there, it states that an employer has to conduct a risk assessment in a workplace in which there's a need to rescue or evacuate people. Okay, so basically it's kind of looking at this generalized, what are the things that can potentially happen in our work environment and what do we need to do to help mitigate that? However, in section 38, there's also additional information. So what it states basically is that if you as an employer are engaged in higher risk work, such as work at high angles or what we call work at height, then an employer must have written rescue and evacuation procedures for that as well, okay? Now, if we look at another reference specific to working at height, this is when we look at section 142 of the regulations, so in particular 142 subsection 10, and this states where an employer utilizes a fall arrest system, then they shall have a written plan or fall protection plan that specifies, and there's some additional other requirements, but I just wanted to focus kind of on one aspect here, the procedure for rescue workers who have fallen and are suspended by that system, but they are unable to effect self-rescue. So there you go. You can see, okay, we have to think about overall, what do we do as an organization? What are the potential scenario emergency situations we can find ourselves in? But then we also have to look a little bit more critically at the type of work that we do, especially if we're in that higher risk sort of employment. And then we have to make sure that we have procedures in the event of an emergency situations for those as well. All right, so that's our first sort of outline, first objective. Now we're moving on and we're looking at emergency response plan. So basically, what do we mean by emergency response plan? And then what are some things we have to think about, some considerations when we think about it? So first thing I just want to highlight before we get into it is that each work site has different hazards and risks associated with it. So when we think about development and implementation and so on of these emergency response plans, we have to think about those different hazards and the risks associated with it, right? So that's pretty much going to be the basis or the meat of our emergency response plans, okay? Now with that, let's just look at the definition of what is meant by emergency response plan. So if you look here on your screen, you can see that's basically telling us that an emergency response plan is just a set of policies and procedures that allows you to prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergency incidents. Okay. The other thing to think about is that they should be developed prior to commencement of work or start of work, and back to this again, they vary from workplace to workplace. So whether you have your permanent facilities or temporary facilities. So generally when we think about, within the construction industry, we can think about the development of sort of like site specific emergency response plans. Generally, this is something that, once again, we're going to have for these temporary locations. And when we think of kind of the basics of what should be in this, we're thinking about, okay, well, an address and description of the site location, emergency response numbers, when you think of like your 911, but also like fire, police, emergency responders, that sort of thing, but also the location of your nearest medical facility in relation to where you're working, and then even having like a map or a route on how you get there. This sort of information should be readily available for workers, and generally it's something that you're going to see posted like in a lunchroom or your trailer, that sort of thing. The other thing I need to highlight when we think about emergency preparedness and emergency response planning, is while we do have to contact 911 in the event of an emergency situation, that alone should not be our plan, okay? If we think about it, if you're solely depending on 911, this may be inadequate for, well, a couple of reasons. First and foremost, local departments may not be equipped to handle the situation, right? So for example, if you have someone working at a significant height and they fall, the fire department may not have the equipment, gear, whatnot to be able to access, to be able to assist with that sort of high angle rescue. The other thing is to look at response times. So it could just be too long. And the other thing we have to think about is that emergency services as well could be responding to another emergency situation, and this may impact their capabilities of actually being able to respond to you. Okay? So with that, employers have to have some sort of investment in training for workers to carry out an emergency response. But with that, they still have to recognize that there may be a situation in which their workers are not equipped to be able to perform that sort of rescue, and it might be a situation in which they need to rely on a third party, so a specialized rescue team, once again thinking about like your high angle rescue, or even thinking about a confined space rescue, to be able to facilitate that emergency response. So now we have to think, well, okay, that's fine. You talked about what an emergency response plan is, but what should I include in it? Well, this is where you're going to be asking a lot of what ifs, all right? So with this, we have to think about what are all the potential or the possible emergency situations? So thinking about, what's the potential for a fire, explosion? What if we had someone who fell from heights? What if we had a chemical spill? What if we had some other form of a critical injury? So then we also have to think about those consequences associated with that what if, with that potential emergency situation. Then we have to think about, well, what do we need to do? What is the action that needs to be taken, as well as procedures and resources? So when we're looking at those procedures, yeah, we're going to include that kind of detailed list of personnel, including like contact information, details of duties and responsibilities, as well as, like any potential floor plans or evacuation routes, equipment, supplies, etc. But our procedures should also include like how people are going to be notified, so that alarm, but workers should also know what that alarm sounds like. Also the reporting aspect, who do I report it to, how and when, identifying those muster areas, so your evacuation, your muster areas, but also looking at what sort of first aid supplies or medical assistance may we need. Um, Also thinking about your training and drills, and we'll go into a little bit more about that later on, but also thinking communication. So what communication do we have to do internally as an organization, as well as externally, and thinking about the modes or the means and the methods in which we're going to be able to communicate. So if you think about, think about our province, and you think about pockets and places within this province where you cannot rely on cell phone reception or your cell phone. Well, in that circumstance or that case, well, what are you going to use? Are you going to use like satellite radio or satellite phone, or are you going to use two-way radio? Like, what are you going to do in these sorts of situations? And the other thing, I just want to kind of step back and look at sort of those resources that will be needed. And when I think about resources, some of the things I think about are like specific equipment or supplies that are going to be needed and identified when we think of developing and implementing these plans. I'm thinking, okay, well, if there's potential for fire, do you have your fire suppression system or your fire extinguishers? Are they suitable based on the potential types of fire that you could have? So when we think about those fire classifications, as well, I also think if it's valid, has it been inspected, all that kind of stuff. Then I think about your first aid. So what sort of first aid treatment are you going to have to provide? What level of first aid kit do you need? So if you think of that, that's based on the risk, based on the type of work that you conduct, which would determine whether you're low, moderate, or high. Are you in a situation, say like a confined space, maybe you need a tripod? Do you need fall protection equipment? So harness, a self-retracting lanyard that potentially has fall arrest as well as descent control, anchorage. What about a rescue pole or a rescue ladder? Are you potentially in an environment where you may need a self-contained breathing apparatus? Generators, absorbent materials, safety data sheets. The list of resources can go on and on, because that is dependent on the potential emergency situations, those potential consequences, and what you need to do in the event this happens. But your plan should include that, right? So now we're going to look at the steps involved in emergency response planning. So these steps to development. According to the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, studies have shown that companies with effective emergency response plans kind of weather the storm much more effectively than others. So once again, it's really critical and important to understand that your emergency response plan has to be specific to kind of the working locations and the unique circumstances associated with that. So remember, you have to consider how things can change and how those potential changes will impact and affect your current emergency response plan. So it's kind of like you got a little voice in the back of your head kind of asking you questions, be like, are we covered? What if this happens? Can we handle this situation? Do we have to revisit this plan? That sort of thing. You can see it's that continual process of checking and acting and doing and making sure that we're on the right track. So when we look at these 5 basic steps in developing an emergency response plan, we can see it's pretty straight up. First and foremost, we got to form a team. We're going to assess those risks and capabilities. We're going to develop and implement the plan. And then, of course, we're going to evaluate it and then revise it based on the results of that evaluation to ensure that we got our bases covered. So first things first, if we look at forming the team, I think it's really important when you think about forming your team that you include various workers with various perspectives. So when you think of that, it can include supervisors, workers, safety personnel. It could also include occupational health and safety committee members, or depending on how big your company is, maybe your worker representative. Additionally, local authorities or third parties. So are you potentially in a situation where you need that specialized rescue team, such as, your high angle rescue? So we want to think, okay, who should be involved in making these plans based on the potential emergencies? So we want to consider personnel with varied skill, with a varied skill set and from all levels of the organization. The other kind of critical component when we think about this is the support that you have from the top, because we need senior management support in development and implementation of these plans, because once again, they're going to show that's demonstration of their commitment, but also ensuring that we have the resources that we need. And it also just kind of highlights to workers that, hey, our company values our safety and thinks, that this is important, right? So it's showing people is that leading, it's critical aspect when you think about the effectiveness of it. The next thing is, okay, we got our team. We're good to go that way. We know who's ready to go, who's good to help. Now we have to think about, well, what can happen? So this is where we're identifying those potential emergency situations, because by asking, what if we had a fire? What if someone fell from heights? What if we had a chemical spill? What if we had hurricane force winds? You have to ask these questions because that is the basis for your plan. So if we look at, those, potential emergency situations, and once again, thinking about, working from heights and stuff like that, we know there is a potential that you can have workers who are falling from heights. And what is kind of interesting to note, which I have italicized there at the bottom of your slide, is that the fall from height incident rate within the construction industry is 3.4 times higher than the provincial rate. Like, wow. Okay. So then when we think of that, when we think about falls from heights, we also have to think about things such as, okay, we have people who potentially fall to floors, walkway surfaces, falls from ladder, falls on or against objects. So, okay, there's those different hazards, associated risks with those different workplace environments, locations, all that kind of stuff. Our plans have to be developed based on the risks associated with the workplace and our work activities. Okay, so we have to determine the types and potential and actual hazards, figure out kind of the probability or likelihood that something like this could occur, and then based on that, who is it going to affect, and what's the possible extent of the worst case scenario when we think of what could happen here, and how are we going to be able to approach it. Once we've assessed those risks and potential capabilities, now the fun part begins, right? Pen to paper, we have to develop that plan. All right, so emergency response plans are needed to know how to respond to help to further prevent, control, or mitigate any further illness, injury, and so on. any further implications of this emergency situation. So there's factors to consider when determining what plans are needed. So once again, when we think about, working at heights, for example, we have to think, hazard-wise. Have we identified all the potential fall hazards? So for example, if we have roof openings or if we have leading edges, or whatever type of fall hazards we have, what sort of controls do we need in place to begin with? Okay. So, whether we are working from control zone or whether we're having guardrails or temporary flooring or we're utilizing a personal fall arrest system. So chances are you're probably going to have a combination of these factors depending on your environment. But if someone is using a personal fall arrest system, we have to think, first thing in my head, I'm thinking, okay, has your fall protection plan been developed, right? Is this something that will be developed in conjunction with the emergency response plan? Then I also think, well, what particular circumstances or limitations are unique to this work location that may affect the ability to be able to initiate or to enact the plan? So with that, I think about if you have a worker who has fallen from heights and is utilizing that personal fall arrest system, first thing comes in my mind is, okay, what's below them, right? Is that interfering with ability to be able to access them? Then I'm also thinking, well, roughly you should have an idea of if they were to fall, their system deploys and stops them, where are they, right? So how can you access them once again? Then also thinking once again about the capacity or capability of personnel to be able to rescue or assist in that, right? So when I think of that, I think about training, but I also think availability to the equipment. Do you have what you need on site to be able to enact that emergency response? Are the people who are assisting with that also protected from the potential fall hazards? And then I think about the resources. So once again, what equipment do we need, right? So do we need, you know, a rescue ladder? Do we need um, rescue poles? Like, what do we need to be able to initiate this sort of scenario? So at the end of it, when we think about developing these procedures as well, we want to try to keep them as clear and concise as possible so that they're easily understood by personnel. Then the fun part of implementing the plan. So first and foremost, what I think it's good to have, like, to assist you in kind of determining what is needed, having those checklists and response plans. So when I think of the checklist, you'll see on the right of your screen, what is there is basically a sample checklist to assist you with developing like fall rescue plan, okay? Or a fall rescue procedure, sorry. So with this, it asks some basic questions. So will someone see the person who's fallen? How will the worker call for help? Also thinking, how will rescue workers get to the worker? What rescue equipment will they use? Also thinking about, like, are there additional considerations that we should take into account? For example, if the person is working alone, or are there other hazards that could affect the ability of us to be able to initiate this rescue? Um, so it kind of gives us a guideline then to be able to develop that response plan, and your response plan is detailing the who, what, when, where, and how, okay? Other things I think about with the implementation aspect is just your administrative component in the sense of, okay, communication. So we have to identify the key personnel who we have to communicate this to. So when we think about workers, subcontractors, visitors, we also have to think, has the Occupational Health and Safety Committee or your worker representative reviewed this plan? Have they provided any input? I also think, is it posted? Is it accessible to people? I think about that training requirement again. So when I think of training, I think about, because there is a lot that is involved in training. I think about, okay, training on equipment, training on responsibilities, that sort of thing. So we have to identify specifically what training is needed, such as that external training. So when we think of like standard first aid, fall protection, rescue training, but also thinking about that internal sort of training component. So, you know, development and review of that early response plan, training on equipment that you may have. Think about your toolbox talks, your orientations where you're reviewing these things. And then, of course, comes practice. Okay, so having those drills, right? Identifying those gaps once again. So we want to go through the plan so people understand their role and whatnot within it. So when we think about training and drills, I mean, that is critical to prepare people for an incident and how we handle that emergency situation. So training ensures that everyone is familiar, they know their role, their responsibility, and the procedure of how to go in the event of this emergency situation. Ultimately, the purpose of it, you know, the training and having these plans is to minimize panic, confusion, and to take this um, bad situation and to prevent it from getting worse. And then when we also think about just, you know, thinking about implementing the plan and training on the plan itself, well, workers should be trained on the emergency response plan initially upon hire. You know, when you think about your orientations at the start of any project, or if they're new on site, if the plan changes, or if there's changes in responsibilities or roles, this is something that should be communicated and workers should be trained on. And finally, we come to the evaluation and revision component. So this is the final step when we think about the five steps in developing a plan. So practice, practice, practice. All right. We want to make sure that we're conducting those drills to ensure the safe and efficiency of our emergency response plan. But it also gives us time to note those areas for improvement. Notice any gaps or changes in people, equipment, material, environment. We have to make sure that we're revising where it's needed. Okay. Then we also have to ensure that we're communicating and training personnel to those changes. All right. So when you think about construction and you think about kind of like projects and activities, you can see that it has to be an ongoing process and a continual process where you're checking on your emergency response plan and procedures to make sure, okay, are they suitable based on where we're at in this project? Is there anything that we need to change? All right, that is why it's critical to do those drills. And just to remind you, under the regulations, section 39 of the regulations, it states that an employer has a responsibility to do an annual emergency drill. And of course, you're supposed to retain the record of that for 5 years. But think chances are, you know, you're going to want to do that more than annually. You're going to want to have some form of a drill on a somewhat regular basis. So, you know, there's different means in which we can communicate this, whether we think go back to like our orientations, go back to our safety meetings, that sort of thing. So it's really critical that we keep this on top of people's minds, right? So in summary, I hope that you have a better comprehension of the legal requirements when we think about emergency preparedness. Uh, in addition to that, I hope you have a better understanding of what is meant by emergency preparedness, as well as some considerations. And you should be, or hopefully you are familiar with the 5 steps involved in developing emergency response plan. So we have to remember, or I hope that you take into account the reason why we have sort of these emergency response plans on the most basic level is to assist in these situations to help people to remain calm. Okay. So we want to kind of take that guesswork out of it. We want people to be able to assess the situation, take command within their respective roles, provide protection, aid and manage the situation within their responsibility, and of course, maintaining contact with personnel that they have to maintain contact with, and of course, assisting with guiding those emergency services as well. So thank you very much for spending this time with me. I hope you got a bit more out of it, and I just will see if there's any questions there that you want me to discuss. I'm sorry, I had a bit of a brain fart there, guys. But I also would like to direct you to our website. So just take a little time to visit us at our website at nlcsa.com. There you'll find a wide array of resources, and as well you'll find our contact information if you ever want to reach out and speak to a advisor and find some further information or some clarification. But thank you very much for this. It's been fun. Let me just see. Tammy?
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thanks for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Again, as Hannah said, there's a ton of resources on our website, and on the Fall Prevention Awareness page, there's a host of resources as well. And if you haven't already, check out Workplace NL's new podcast called The Signal. Their most recent episode was actually on slip, trip, and fall hazards. So if you haven't had a chance to check that out, you can actually, subscribe to the webinar right through our web page for Fall Prevention Awareness Week, or you can listen to the podcast right on the site as well.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Hannah.